Alright, the 99 Mustang Cobra has this fuel rail system. This is a returnless system. So fuel comes in from the fuel pump and the computer controls the speed of the fuel pump and ultimately the flow and pressure of the fuel based on requirements of the motor, like whether or not you're accelerating or what have you. I am tossing this because in my 66 Mustang, my fuel tank is the 66 fuel tank that I converted to fuel injection, but it doesn't have a fuel pump that could or really should be controlled by the computer. So I'm going to make new fuel rails, and basically the fuel will come into the passenger side fuel rail, and then out the front of the passenger side fuel rail and over to the driver's side fuel rail, and then out the rear of the driver's side fuel rail into a fuel regulator that's mounted on the firewall or somewhere under the hood, and then a return line back to the fuel tank. So basically the fuel pump runs wide open all the time, and the pressure is controlled by the fuel regulator. It's just a number that I set. So in order to do all this, I've found a place at Ross Racing. I found fuel rails at Ross Racing. This is an extrusion. It's an aluminum fuel rail, and there's not a whole lot to it. It's just got a hole right through it and plenty of meat to work with. So I've got to drill the 4 holes for the fuel injectors, and then I've got to mortise 2 slots in it to receive 1-inch wide aluminum bar, and then it'll get a couple screws to hold in that aluminum bar, and that aluminum bar will mount on the intake manifold where these 2 brackets previously mounted. So I've already measured all this. My diameter for the fuel injector hole or port is 33/64, so it's pretty funky size. Actually not that funky. It's pretty easy to find bit. And a couple things I've discovered, because I did some test holes and test mortises, sort of. They're on the side, so not really mortise, but I did all these tests, and a couple things I discovered is definitely set the speed on your drill press to the appropriate speed for the size hole you're drilling into this material. Don't use cutting oil. I found that when I used cutting oil, the 3 holes I used cutting oil on, the holes ended up bigger than the 1 hole I didn't use cutting oil. So there's got to be some correlation there, but just don't use cutting oil. It's unnecessary. The other thing I discovered is definitely start with a smaller bit. So in my case, I'm starting with probably a 3/8 inch bit. So I'll drill to the correct depth with 3/8, and then I'll come back with the 33/64 bit and finish the hole. And that makes the wall of the hole nice and clean. In the absence it also makes the hole the correct diameter too. In the absence of that, I think it's removing so much material that the bit vibrates a little bit and the hole ends up being slightly bigger than you want it. It probably will still work. I'm sure the fuel injectors would seal, but you get a perfect hole when you pre-drill it with the 3/8 bit. After I drill all 4 holes to their appropriate size, then I come back with the cordless drill and I drill the hole in the center that penetrates into the actual fuel part of the fuel rail. The larger hole doesn't go that deep. So next thing I did is, after figuring all that out, I built this kind of jig, for lack of a better word. It's built out of hickory, so it's pretty strong, and I just use it to hold the stock in place while I set it on the drill bit, on the drill press. I put a 2x4 sort of fence on the drill press, and I put some marks. Let's see if we can see this on here. So I put some marks on top of this 2x4, and I have a mark on this, meaning it just says start. So I do my first hole like that. So I'll set it on this mark and clamp it. After that, I'll move on to the next mark, set it appropriately and clamp it, and then the third and then the fourth. Clamping it each time, knowing that the pencil line is probably thicker than I want, so I'm going right in the middle. But you do have a little bit of play in these things. The fuel rail sits, on top of the fuel injectors, and the whole thing sits about 2 inches above the intake manifold. And whether you like it or not, there is a little bit of play in there. And so it's okay if the fuel injectors are off. And by off, I'm talking about half the thickness of a pencil line. So, maybe 1/32nd, 1/64th, probably more like 1/64th of an inch at the most. So it's not a huge deal because of the thickness of the pencil line. I could have made like positive stops for this whole thing to make sure they were exact, but I think, like most things, they're exact enough. So I'm going to set up the drill to drill the first 4 holes and double check to make sure I'm still on the center of this thing, and then I'll move the camera so you can see that. All right, so this is mounted in the drill press, clamped to the fence is clamped to the drill press. I have my marks on there. So one at a time, I'm going to drill these. I set the depth gauge on the drill press to the appropriate depth. So we'll see how it goes here. Moved to my next mark. And use a straight edge to make sure I'm on the mark. Perfect. Now I'm going to switch out the blank and do the other one. I didn't cap these solid, I just capped the top so I could get at the bottom to move the blank out when I need to. It's pretty snug. So there's that one. Again, going back to my start mark. Perfect. And there's no left or right on these. They mirror one another, so you know what I use on the driver's side I can use on the passenger side. last one. Now I'm going to switch drill bits to the 33/64 bit. Change my depth gauge if necessary. Yes, definitely necessary. I got a little depth gauge issue. The stop on the depth gauge is floating a little bit, which I'm not really putting any pressure on it, so it's not a huge deal. That should be good. All right, back to the first mark. It's not a huge deal if I'm not putting the work back in the exact same spot. Like if it's off, you know, 1/128th of an inch or something like that. It's not going to affect anything because the difference in the two holes is pretty significant, so it's still going to create the correct size hole. All right. Nice and clean. Very nice. So there you go. And do the other 4. One thing you do have to do when this goes in here, it has to go back in the exact same direction it came out. So the distance from the edge of this hole to the end of the rail and from the edge of this hole to the end of the rail is not the same. It's a tiny bit different. So, but it's easy to see if I line the rails up. I can see that those holes don't line up. But when I line up this way, they do. So I need to put this rail in there like that. Oh, sorry. And you have to line up the star. Oh wait, seems being difficult. Now I'll pull them out, and actually I won't pull them out. I'll do the center hole in here. I was going to do it by hand. So let me switch bits again. On my test piece, I did this with the cordless drill, and it works fine because it's going down into the bevel of the previous drill, but it's probably going to be a little cleaner to do it this way. Well, we'll see here. And then from a depth standpoint, I'm going to go through the first one until I punch through into the fuel chamber, and then I'll set the depth gauge at that time. Alright, depth-wise we're good. And the hole is a lot cleaner than doing it on the drill. Just so confirm that. Alright, switch out this. Again, making sure I line up the right ends.
Last hole.